Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited and our twin charged Magnum project. Now we're going to pick up right where we left off in our last episode. I'm going to be working on getting our turbo oil return drain bung installed in the oil pan. That way I can get the oil pan back on this engine. And I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but we can finally get the engine into the car for the final time. Let's get into it. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about with the turbo oil drain line, when you have a turbocharger on your vehicle, this thing is going to be cooled by oil. So there's an oil feed line going to it, and there's a return line coming out the bottom that needs to go back to your engine oiling system. So one of the easiest ways to do that is go ahead and drill a hole in your engine oil pan and get that return line to come right to it. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that whatever fitting you install here, you want to install as high as you can on the oil pan itself, because this oil that's returning out of the turbo is strictly gravity fed. So if you have the return line down here at the bottom of the oil pan where all the oil is already sitting, it's kind of a blockage for that oil. It makes it really hard for it to return to the pan, and if that happens, that oil can actually back up into the return line and eventually push its way past the seals in the turbo and start smoking like crazy. So of course, one way to get past that is to put that drain as high as possible in the pan itself, so that even under just gravity, that oil can freely flow right back into the pan. Now I've got this 10AN aluminum weld-on fitting here. It's going to go right here on this oil pan. We need to get this hole drilled, get this prepped, and get it welded. My only concerns here is that because this is a cast pan, cast aluminum does not weld anywhere near as good as just pure aluminum does, but generally some of these newer style cast aluminums aren't as bad as some of the older ones. The only concern here is that because this pan has had oil in it for so long, it's not a new pan, that some of that oil can actually soak its way into the pores of the metal and cause for very poor welding. So I'm gonna try to heat this thing up with a torch first, try to burn some of those impurities out of there, wire brush it, try to get it as clean as I possibly can before I weld it. I certainly hope this goes smoothly because I don't want this to be a big project. All right, there we go. I'm actually very pleased with that. Now, this isn't going to be the most beautiful welding you've ever seen, but in my opinion, welding it on cast aluminum and used cast aluminum at that, I'm actually really happy with how this came out. Now, you'll notice there that I actually welded the inside of the bung first, and that's because I knew I wouldn't be able to get all the way around the outside here. So I wanted to weld up the inside, make sure it's completely sealed, and then just give it some extra support on the outside of the weld. But that's all done. We can put this pan back on. First thing we need to do here is we need to install our oil pan gasket. Now, this oil pan gasket also doubles as the windage tray on a Hemi engine, and you have to install that first before you can reinstall your oil pickup tube and then put the pan on. So the one tip I have for you is that you do need to use some engine RTV only on the seams here where the cast iron block meets the aluminum of the rear main and the front timing cover. Just on those 4 points of contact there, and then you can put the pan gasket on. One thing I highly recommend when you're reinstalling an oil pan is to make sure you actually start all of your bolts first, get at least a couple of threads on all of them before you go tightening them down. Because if you start at one corner and start tightening down there, by the time you get all around to the other side, a lot of times the holes won't line up correctly, and these bolts are actually really tiny and it doesn't take a lot to snap them. So if the hole is slightly off center and you're like, oh, I'll just force it in there, and you get a couple of turns in and it goes snap. You don't want to have to deal with that. So again, just real quick step, just start the bolts, a couple of threads each, and then tighten them down. Another tip here, you don't want to kill these bolts when you're tightening these things down. Again, these are small bolts, they don't really need to be that tight. I'm not sure exactly what the torque spec is offhand, probably around like 80 inch-pounds, somewhere around there. That's not a lot, okay? So you'll notice that I'm using a quarter drive ratchet here and it only has a very short throw on it. So it's one of those things where you just go ahead and snug them up, but you don't need to just keep cranking on them until they won't possibly turn anymore, okay? Just be smart about it. Again, you don't want to snap these bolts. Okay, one more project in the books there. Now, in our last episode, I talked about how I was going to go ahead and weld up our crossover tube here solid, because since I have the engine out of the vehicle, there's really good access to get to everything. However, as I also mentioned previously, our up pipe here, because it has so many seams, there was a lot of opportunity for it to move and twist and be different from its original location. And that's certainly the case. When I went to mock up this crossover tube, I actually found that it was almost an inch off from its previous location. So to be honest, I'm not comfortable welding it up solid as it sits. I need to put this thing back in the car and make sure that it'll actually specifically clear the steering shaft on the thing coming down. So I need to do that before I can actually weld up this cross member. Now this crossover tube's not such a huge deal because, again, I can just remove it from the vehicle and weld it on the bench. Not gonna be that big of a deal. I think the one thing I'm going to do before I put the engine back in the car is I do want to finish building a brace for our up pipe here off the side of the block, just so it has some extra support and won't be wobbling around and have a potential for cracking. Okay, to start working on our brace here, you can see I've turned up a couple of these little bungs here, kind of just like this one here. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna make a crossover here between the two, and it's gonna come up and join this pipe here. There'll be a tab coming off of this pipe that'll be supported, that'll be stainless, and that'll be it. It'll just be one simple bolt holding it from here straight to the motor mount. I think it'll be nice and simple. All right, just went ahead and got this bracket put together. Now again, as I've talked about before, don't overcomplicate something like this. It doesn't need to be the strongest and most rigid thing possible. This is just a connection point for our up pipe here, not a big deal. So a nice simple little bracket here and a nice simple bracket on the up pipe itself. Let's go ahead and get this thing on the engine. You can see what it looks like. All right, so you can see it just bolts to the motor mount here, and it's actually very strong, very sturdy, and going to do exactly what I need it to do. Okay, this time I'm not going to say that this is the last time this engine's going into this car. I sincerely hope it is, but you never know what can happen from here on out. Let's get this thing back in the car. By the way, one quick note, the last time I put this thing in, I talked about how this little spacer shield here between the engine and trans likes to pop off constantly, and there's kind of different techniques that people will use to hold those in place. Last time I just went ahead and tacked it with my welder, and that actually worked out pretty well. But a bunch of guys commented afterwards that they use zip ties here in the corners, and I was like, that's a pretty good idea too. So that's what I'm doing this time around, using some zip ties. Well, I have to admit, the engine definitely fought me a bit more than it normally does, but it's back in, ready to go. Let's go ahead and get this thing test fit and see if we needed to make any modifications to it. Well, unfortunately, it did pull quite a bit, and it's basically touching our steering shaft, just like I thought it might. So basically, I need to pull that back out. We're gonna need to make a cut somewhere around there. Just shift it right back to where it needs to be. Not really a huge deal, but still a bit of a pain. All right, got this thing adjusted. I actually like it better even than it was before. I think we have more clearance here, especially around the actual steering shaft. Let's see here. There you go, you can kind of see there. It's a lot better clearance around the steering shaft now. So we just need to zip up that weld right there, and the up pipe will be pretty much ready to go. A little bit of modification required for our crossover tube. It's a little bit wider now than it used to be. Not a big deal at all. Okay, I didn't want to bore you guys with any more on this crossover pipe because you've kind of seen enough on it already. I just went ahead and got it modified, switched up the sizing a little bit to make it fit, and got it all welded up. And I'm actually really happy with how all the welds came out in this thing. You know, thinner stainless can be a bit tricky, but I was really trying to take my time on this one, and I believe the back purging was really helping as well. So again, super happy with how this turned out. Let's go ahead and get this thing installed on the vehicle. All right, you guys, so the very last thing we need to do to actually completely finish our up pipe is to get our wastegate flange installed. Now, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes here to explain exactly what a wastegate does and why it's important to have. All right, you guys, it is time for another whiteboard segment. It's been a while since I've done one of these, but I want to clearly explain the differences between a wastegate and a blow-off valve. I know when I was first getting started in this whole thing, it was very easy to confuse the two of these and what their exact purposes are, so let's go over that real quickly. Now, a wastegate and a blow-off valve both involve the diverting of air, so it can be easy to get them confused and think that they're doing the same thing, when the reality is they're actually doing completely opposite jobs on different ends of the spectrum. So let's start with a wastegate. Why do we need a wastegate? Well, in this incredible drawing of an engine I have here, so right here you have the exhaust tubing that is going into our turbo here. Obviously the exhaust is what is powering our turbo, spinning our turbo. The problem is that the faster the engine turns, the more exhaust pressure it's pushing into this turbo. And so the higher you rev this thing, the more boost it's going to make. We need to have a way to control the amount of boost that the engine is seeing. The wastegate is how you do that. Essentially, the wastegate is diverting some of that exhaust pressure away from the turbocharger to maintain the turbo at the current boost level it's getting. So all it's doing is it's bypassing a certain amount of exhaust gases past the turbo, around the turbo, into your regular exhaust. That's literally all that a wastegate does. Now there's a couple of different ways of achieving this. A lot of factory turbos have an internal wastegate. We're going to be going with an external wastegate, but the concept is identical. It is simply bypassing that exhaust pressure around the turbo to maintain a consistent boost pressure. That is what a wastegate does. All right, let's transition over to the blow-off valve side of things. So now your turbo is spinning at a consistent RPM, it's generating a consistent boost pressure. That boost is moving through the intake tube here. This is your air-to-air intercooler down here. It's moving up into the intake manifold and into the engine. Now on modern gasoline powered engines, you have a throttle body, which includes a throttle blade in here. So you have this pipe that's full of boost pressure. What happens when you let off the throttle? Well, this blade is going to snap shut. Now the turbo is still spinning. It's still generating that boost pressure for a brief period of time. So this pipe is still pressurized. Now what happens when that boost runs up against this closed blade? Well, it's going to want to try to revert back through the system and go back into the compressor housing. And this can actually stall out the compressor wheel, give you like a turbo flutter type of noise, and it's really not good for your turbocharger to experience that. So a blow-off valve is only there for when the throttle blade closes. It takes that excess boost pressure that's already in the intake track and vents it out to the atmosphere and gets rid of it until you get back on the gas and you can regenerate that pressure through the turbocharger. So again, both of these devices, the blow-off valve and the wastegate, they do involve the diverting of air, but they do it for different reasons entirely. The main thing to keep in mind is that the wastegate is always something to do with the exhaust side, and the blow-off valve always has to do with the intake side. Now, another interesting side point here is that diesels don't have blow-off valves because they don't have throttle bodies. They don't have any sort of a valve in the inlet system, so they don't need to vent any excess pressure. So that's why diesels don't have blow-off valves. So wastegate placement is one of those things that you really want to take your time and think about. There's such thing as wastegate priority, which means placing the wastegate in such a way that will have the most effective chance of actually controlling that boost pressure. So again, with a situation like this, we're extremely space limited, but I have an idea of where I want to put this thing. And basically I'm going to get it right down here next to the turbocharger. And this way I can actually recirculate the wastegate right back into the downpipe itself. I'm not really a huge fan of screamer pipes myself, which is basically when they're just left to atmosphere. I like to recirculate them back into the exhaust. I think it's a cleaner sound, a neater sound. But anyway, this is about the only place I can put this thing, so this is where it's going to go. So what we got here is we're going to be putting our wastegate right here. And again, to help with the wastegate priority, I'm going to try to use a curved or basically angled bend right off of this flange here so that actually we'll have a nice smooth inlet to the wastegate so it can help control that boost pressure as accurately as possible. So I've already kind of created this piece here, just getting it roughed out so we can actually get it welded up right there. Now, I think that's going to work out really well. However, cutting this hole in the first place is going to be a little bit tricky. Let's try to get into that. So because we are dealing with two completely separate tubes here, it's gonna be a little bit tricky here. We don't wanna drill in too far, obviously. I think I'm gonna start with a hole saw drill right here, and then probably clean up the edges with a carbide to open it up to this kind of heart shape that we're looking for. But again, because you have separate pipes right here, we only wanna go about halfway through, and then we're gonna have to cut out these sides here to actually weld up the inside of both of these pipes before we actually weld the flange to the outside so that's completely sealed. So it's gonna be a little bit tricky, but I still think we can do it. We just have to get into it and try. Okay, many hours later, and I finally have this flange welded onto the up pipe. Now, truth be told, I knew it was going to take forever. That's kind of why I was putting it off so long. Having to cut that really awkwardly shaped hole, grind it all out, weld it up in a really tight confined area. Definitely a tricky situation, but definitely I'm happy with how it came out. I think it's going to flow very nicely as far as letting some of that excess exhaust out of there so we can control our boost. Now, in order to get the actual flange where I need it, I have to do a 90-degree turn right off of here and go up next to this flange here for the turbo. And honestly, all of my regular mandrel bends that I have aren't quite tight enough, so I did have to end up going with pie cuts. And honestly, I'm not a huge fan of pie cuts anymore. I used to think they look amazing. Now I just think they're a gigantic waste of argon, but they are necessary in certain situations to give yourself a tight enough radius to actually fit in there. So I have it done here. I already welded the flange on for the wastegate itself, and it's just going to weld directly to our up pipe just like that. Now, as soon as I weld this on solid, I'm going to weld a brace in between the turbo flange and the wastegate pipe here, and hopefully that'll give it enough strength where I don't have to worry about it cracking. Now, eventually, will I have a cracking problem? Maybe, possibly, but I think with a brace between the turbo and the wastegate, I think it should work out pretty well. So let's get this thing welded on and be done with this up pipe. Finally, this piece is done. The up pipe is completely finished. We have our wastegate flange on there, welded the little brace in there to our main flange, hopefully give this thing some strength for the future. Man, this is actually a really complicated piece here. A lot happening here. I really don't ever want to try to replicate this ever again. You know, I know I had a couple of guys who were asking me if I'd be willing to make another set for them, and the answer is absolutely not. This is way too labor intensive to do one-off stuff like this. There's no way. But like I said, really happy with how this thing came out. Let's go ahead and get this thing back on the vehicle. Nice thing is this thing actually fits in here with a minimum of twisting. There we go. And just like that, she's in. Oh man, look at this. Got the turbo and the wastegate in there. Really happy with how it came out. It's exactly where I wanted it to be. Fits in there great. Avoids the alternator and the belt. Man, couldn't be happier with how that came out. Exactly what I was hoping for. And with that, you guys, our entire Hotside turbo plumbing is done for this project. In the next episode, you'll see me work on either the downpipe or we'll be moving on to the fuel system, one or the other. We'll see what I feel like doing next. I want to thank you guys so much for following along. We'll see you next time on Reignited.